Hi there everyone, welcome back to Dandelion Delphi Tutorials. Today we're going to look at a harder question, and that is question 4 of the final of 2019. All the last questions of past papers are problem solving questions that will challenge you a bit. So this last question of the final exams are often your more difficult questions. But there are lots in each question that you are able to do, even if you find it difficult to problem solve the more complex parts. So try this yourself, read the question and press pause, and we'll work through it hereafter together. So the question is asking us to get the name of this maze. There were these text files from the combo box, and the user is going to select which maze they would like to view. So we had to here display a message if the file does not exist, and then we had to read this text file one line at a time into an array, and also then display this maze with the corresponding line number, so that will match the index of your array. Here is an example of output when maze 1 was selected. This was in your text file, and this would now be your index. As always, you need to first have a look at what was provided, and an array was provided with an index from 1 to iRow count, and iRow count was a constant, and that was set to 16. And this array holds string data types. So the dot clear here was provided, and below the dot clear of your rich edit, there was a comment there that said add your code here. Make sure that you always code below this line and not above it. So you first had to get the input from the user from the combo box for the name of the text file. The name matched in the combo box, but you had to add .txt to match the file name and its file extension. So first what I've done is I've built a string with a .txt according to what the user selected from my combo box. Remember, this line of code makes life easy because you don't need a case statement now to get all those names. And remember that you have to repeat the name of the object in the square brackets with the .item index. And this same code works also for radio group and list boxes. So combo boxes can use it as well as the other two. We had to test if the file exists, and I always just use an if statement with a begin and an end. Because then I don't need an else and more begins and ends at the bottom, but you are allowed to use try except. So here I'm using file exist of this name that I've just built, and if that's not true, or you could also say here equals to false, I display a message and I exit that procedure. Very important is that you have this begin and end here, else your code will never run because it will always exit here without the begin and end. Here we get to the reading from the text file. This code really needs to be studied and can be used in any question. Text files are not only part of the last question. So I'm assigning the file tfile, which I declared as a text file, to this name that I've built here at the top according to the user's input. Since I'm reading from the file, I'm using a reset. Don't try and append and rewrite in here as well. We're either going to read from it or we're going to write to it. And then I needed a counter because you were required to display the number, the index number or the corridor number in the scenario in your rich edit. So I've initialized iCount here because I'm using inc iCount. And remember, when we're reading from a text file, we're going to use a while loop. And also remember that not for while I've not reached the end of file marker. I always add the second condition here to prevent my program from crashing. So this is my counter that I'm using, and this here is that global variable or the global constant that was set to 16. If the text file had more lines than 16, this here will prevent my program from crashing, because it won't allow me to add more lines to my array than there is space for, because remember the array was declared 1 to iRow count. Now I'm incrementing my counter, and then I'm reading from the text file into my array with my square brackets I count. So the first time you are looping, we are reading the first line from the text file into array 1 because I've incremented I count there to 1. And then I'm also displaying this counter as well as a #9 to make that nice neat column with the value that is now stored in array maze with, for example, 1 the first time it loops. Second time it loops, I count as 2 and we read the second line into array maze 2. Very important is that you don't forget to close your file. This is important because there are marks allocated for it, as well as if we had to read from this text file again at a later point while the program was running, or we had to write to it, we would not have been able to do that unless we had the close file here. So that was really 11 very easy marks, things that you could have studied reading from a text file into an array. And now comes the more complex part. So I want you to try this. I'll show you the output soon. Press pause and try it yourself. So your maze represents corridors, and a consecutive dashes means there's open spaces in that corridor. And your job was to find the corridor or more than one row that had the most open spaces for the maze selected. If you are struggling with this question, just first try to get one row showing of which one has the longest corridor. And remember, consecutive means they are together. So the moment you see a hash, that means the corridor, the open spaces stop there and you have to stop counting. But you also need to know what is the longest corridor overall. And once you've accomplished that, then try to display the list of rows. So sometimes it's just one row with a maximum number of open spaces, but sometimes there's more than one. And another tricky part is to only show one of each row, because one of the rows contained 2 corridors with the maximum number of open spaces. So let's have a look at the example of output here of maze 1. Maze 1, the longest corridor, had 7 spaces, but there were rows 2, 4, and 13 that contained 7 spaces. The trick here was also that this row 13 contained 2 sets of 7 spaces, and you didn't want to display 13 twice, you wanted to display 13 only once. Here is an example of maze 3. So you first have to select maze 3, click on display maze, and then only click on the longest corridor, since you want to first read this maze into the array and then determine the longest corridor. There are multiple correct answers. What we did in this exam is we ran this program, and if you got the output correctly, we would then go back into your code and make sure that you've used first principles in your array. I'm going to show you a reminder of what code you weren't allowed to use. So here are those functions that are not allowed. These are not first principles, and you have to write code to kind of create these functions yourself. So be aware that you're not allowed to use arrays using the functions high, low, sum, mean, max value, and min value. Even though it would make life easier, you won't score any marks for those. A little tip is, if you are using an array without the square brackets, you are not using first principles. So make sure that when you're using your array, you are always looping through it, making use of a square bracket. And just as a reminder, you're also not allowed to write to a text file using your rich edit and save to file, or also displaying a text file using load from file from a rich edit. So I've declared an array max, and you are allowed to create local or global arrays as if you feel the need to use them in this question. And mine has space for my 16 corridors. And if I find that this corridor that I'm currently in while looping has the same number of open spaces than the previous max or even higher, I then store that value into array max. So just to understand what my variables are doing, my imax is holding the most open spaces overall. And then iCount, you can see it's being initialized inside of each row. iCount is initialized inside of my for loop because it's holding the highest number of open spaces per row. Now, even though this question is a one-dimensional array, this is almost like using a two-dimensional array because here we're looping through each row, and then within that we loop through each maze, and then with string handling looking to see if it is a dash. So similar rules from the two-dimensional array can actually be applied here. If the question asked us something to calculate overall, like finding the highest value overall, we initialize that value like imax above the for loop. And if it was a row question, we started with a for loop for the row, and this is a row question. And then within each row, we initialize iCount to 0. So that is finding the highest open corridor per row. So my outer loop with k is going to each index of my one-dimensional array. So we start at row 1. Row 1 had just ats in them, so it's actually ignored. You could have started at 2 and go up to iCount row -1. So let's say I'm in the second row. I'm starting with my counter as 0. Then I'm looping through that row or that corridor, and I'm finding the open spaces. So this here, I'm looping through the length of one of my rows. A row could look like this. I just copied something out from my text file, which is currently sitting inside of my array, so you can visually see what we're trying to do. So I'm looping here through the whole string, and I'm testing if each character, so remember array maze k, that holds the value of one row, like an entire row like that, and then j is looping within that to each character. And if that character, that's j, is a dash, I increment my counter. And in this if statement testing for the dashes, after I've incremented my counter, I then test if it's greater or equal to imax. Remember, imax I set to 0, and that's going to hold the greatest number overall, so the most open spaces overall in all the rows of this maze. And if this is true, I am storing iCount over imax, and I'm then keeping imax in this position array max k. So let's say row 2 had the greatest number of open spaces, and it was a value of 6. 6 would now be stored in array max 2. Now, the moment that I don't have a dash anymore, my else will be executed here, and iCount will be changed to 0 again to initialize the next part of this corridor. Remember now, we are looking for the number of consecutive dashes. The moment that it's a hash, that's not a consecutive dash, that's not an open space anymore. And when I have to reset this counter for this line, and that's what I'm doing in my else here. The moment it's not a dash anymore, I'm resetting. So let's say it came to this hash, I'm setting iCount to 0 again, and I'm counting the next set of consecutive dashes and comparing it against imax. So this here is the end of this for loop here. And in this way, I'm going to loop through each maze and each corridor of each row and counting the maximum number of dashes. So by the end of this for loop, imax will hold the greatest number of open spaces overall. And my array max will have numbers in there if that specific row had a value greater or equal to that max. To help you understand what I am doing, I've just displayed here the row index for you, the line in my array, and then this last number that you see at the end here, this is my value stored in array max. So you can see at 2, the max was changed to 7, and 7 was also stored then in array max. And then this was row 4 was also 7, so 7 was also stored in array max. So lower numbers have also been stored. But I'm testing here maze 3 because that gives me the best output to show you guys. The last line here had 11 open spaces. So 11 is stored in array max, and keep this in mind for what I'm going to show you next. What I have added quickly was just to initialize array max, else we're going to have funny numbers in there. So we're setting them all to 0, and then I am just replacing them with a number if it needs to be. So just take note of the output in the screenshot. You'll see there's an empty line below the display of the corridors or the maze, and then also a label displaying Imax, and Imax have the most open spaces overall. Now in my solution, I'm looping now through my array max, and if the value stored in there is equal to Imax, I'm then displaying K, which corresponds now with my corridor number. I hope this helped you grade 12s. It's very important that you really practice these final questions. As from 2018, it's the ones on question 4, but before that, it's all the question 3s, and you can work yourself down all the way to final of 2008 and do as many as you can. But always try and do what you know needs to be done and tackle the difficult parts later. You can add your empty line, you can add your labeling, you can display a variable here. You know we're looping, so place your loops there, put your if statements there, and then just do the best you can. Always leave this question for last so that it does not use up time for question 1 to 3 that you hopefully know a little bit better and is easier to solve. Thank you for watching Dandelion Delphi tutorials. For more information about two-dimensional arrays, you can find those in book 3, but book 2 will contain one-dimensional array content. Hope to see you soon!